but you realize like because you're pursuing a social station like Eichmann, or you don't want to be disavowed by a friend group, you do that thing anyway. And that's how I view that part of my life.
I love that you're comparing yourself to Eichmann in this conversation.
Yeah.
It's hilarious. Let's snip at that, hubby.
Talk about assassination at all, or should we just totally not?
Yeah, we
touch
can
it?
if you have thoughts on it. Like, I just don't really have much to say about it. But so just for the listener. So that happened a couple days ago. I was at a festival. I was on acid, and I heard about it at one camp, and it fucking knocked me around for like 20 minutes. And I did everything I could to not bring it to the other camp, just like spread negative vibes, like talking about heavy politics and stuff.
You just walked into the other camp. You're holding your ear the whole time. What's wrong with you?
But so I haven't logged into Twitter and done too much research or investigation into it because I've just been kind of coming back to life. So I'll just kind of ask a good amount of questions. But like, I don't know, what are your thoughts on the attempted assassination of Mr. Donald J?
Yeah, I guess I have some immediate thoughts, but maybe it's more interesting from the perspective of the kinds of topics we cover on the podcast to approach it from sort of a meta level. And one thing I've noticed that's interesting, and where it's highlighted the importance of having some sort of coherent epistemology, or the utility of having some sort of coherent epistemology, is this emerging split I'm seeing between people who are extremely policy focused and some people who are extremely norm focused.
Interesting.
So, okay, what do I mean by that? After the assassination attempt, there was sort of this upwelling of support for Trump. And I think we basically saw overnight it become much more socially acceptable in certain quarters for people to accept Trump and to voice their true opinion, which is good. I mean, I think we want a culture where people are allowed to say what they're thinking. So I'm all for openness in that sense. But it was a little surprising to me to be scrolling Twitter and seeing, support coming out. Like, for instance, from tons of tech people, all of a sudden it was like very cool to support Trump. And then so, yeah, we don't have to get into it, but just from a lot of subgroups where I think before there had been a bit of a stigma against associating or supporting.
But is it your thought that after this, a lot of people who had secretly always supported Trump felt more emboldened to just come out with their support? Or do you think it actually changed people's minds such that previously they didn't support him and now they do?
I think it's both. And I think there's also this sort of like cultural excitement where you see a bunch of people starting to support him and people are getting amped up about his picture with the American flag behind him and his fist raised in the air. There's this social wave of excitement that they want to sort of jump on board with. But yeah, I don't want to speculate too much about motivations, but I've now listened to either read a couple things from people who support Trump or listened to various podcasts. So for instance, last night I was listening to Mark Andreessen and Ben Horowitz's podcast where they just did a recent episode on like why they're supporting Trump. Yeah, one thing I really notice is, which is maybe a priori obvious, is like the focus on policies. So a lot of Trump supporters will come out and say Biden's really bad on X, Y, and Z. Maybe he's bad from their perspective on the environment and on taxation and on military or on progress and nuclear energy and et cetera, et cetera. And undoubtedly, there's some super valid complaints there. And I'm certainly not even willing to have the reaction that says Biden's everywhere better than Trump on policy, right? I think there are many aspects where Biden's politics like don't align with mine. And I'm as scared as the next libertarian sort of leaning type guy who's like pretty worried about government overreach and all this stuff. So I don't even doubt that if you just had like a sort of normal Republican presidency, that there would be policies that might be better for the country overall coming out of that than a Democratic presidency. But I think what all these people miss by focusing so much on policies is Deutsch's whole thing of the means of error correction, right? So we have one candidate who's in flagrant violation always of the norms of democracy. And for me, that becomes a much more important issue than any policy in general, because the means to correct bad policies is more important than getting it right on the first time, right? And I would much, much rather have a candidate that enacts bad policies, but doesn't further erode democratic norms in such a way to start destabilizing the country, so that we can get it right in the future. And so for me, the erosion of like cultural and institutional norms that Trump just sort of brings to bear by his whole political game is a much more important meta issue than any particular policy, where I might be willing to admit, like, Trump might even be better on this particular taxation policy, what have you, than Biden. And so so it's just this interesting thing where I've noticed, like, okay, this is another place where I think your epistemology meets reality. Like the rubber hits the road in terms of the kinds of things you care about and the ordering among things you care about. Like, do you really think preserving the means of error correction is one of the most important features of our Atlantic community, to use Popper's phrase? And I fully think it is. And so I'm fully ready. You know, I'm not American, so I can't vote, but I'd be fully ready to support a candidate whose individual policies I like less. I don't even know if I do, but just positing that I might, over one that I think runs the risk of sort of further eroding these sorts of norms.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I would go further that it's beyond just norm violation now. Like, it's actually causing like legislation change, in the sense that the Supreme Court's recent decision to provide absolute immunity to a former president is quite frankly terrifying, I think, because it means that Trump will basically be exonerated for the majority, if not all, of the cases put against him. Like, I know he's a convicted felon, but when he's the president, let's say he's just sentenced to something very trivial, like community service, say. Do you think he's going to do that? Of course he's not going to do that. And then what's going to happen when there is a convicted felon who is sentenced to some sort of punishment, and then he just says no? He says, "You and what army?" Right? And have you looked into Project 2025? Like, that's not norm violation anymore. That is full on constitutional reform in the direction of like Christian nationalism. And of course, Trump isn't personally responsible for that document. He couldn't even read the first paragraph, I'm sure. But it doesn't matter, because what the Heritage Institute has done is they've done all the research. And so when he just goes off the cuff and says, "I want X, Y, Z to happen," now the research has been done and the team of lawyers will be able to follow the recipe, and this will actually take place. And for example, one of the things that's going to potentially happen, which I've heard before Project 2025, and also then was reinforced in Project 2025, is like every time there's an administration change, so talking about like error correction and stuff, the cabinet changes, but there's like 10,000 low-level government employees that stay fixed, right? And in this project, he's planning on getting rid of all of them and replacing them entirely with Trump lackeys. And so now the norm of just following the tradition of the Constitution is going to be severely broken, such that people will just kind of just not follow it nearly as much anymore. And like the whole assassination attempt thing, the fact that it's providing support for Trump, I find to be fucking appalling, frankly. I think that he's the reason why there is now political violence. The political violence has been escalating because of him and because of the insurrection attempt on January 6th, not to mention saying things like "lock her up," not to mention just his utter disregard for the truth. And the claim is like, well, what's so bad about norms? That's a very squishy thing. It's like, now we're seeing this. Like, I claim that the assassination attempt is a consequence of violating the norms over the last 7 years. And one such norm is don't shoot your political opponents. And that is a very important norm, which is now being eroded. And I attribute that entirely to Trump. And the fact that people can be so blown around by one image of him putting his fist in the air and giving him sympathy. Like, I simply don't see how someone can arrive at that position who has any sort of understanding at all about what's happened over the last 7 years. Like, he is the reason he got shot. And can you put me, so you've read more Twitter and you listen to more podcasts on this, but can you put me in the headspace of someone who, after the attempt, is more sympathetic to Trump? Like, what is Mark Andreessen say?
Just before we get to that, I mean, one annoying thing is this meme going around that, like, you know, the Democrats are all worried that Trump is going to cause, a democratic crisis. He was in office for 4 years and that didn't come to pass. He didn't try and hold power. He didn't try and change the Constitution. What are you so worried about this time, right? He's just sort of an average Republican president. And when people are saying this, I feel like I experience the same frustration that Sam Harris must deal with when he's dealing with people who claim that the ultra-religious don't believe what they say they believe, because Trump's he's telling you by words and by actions the kinds of violations he'd like to commit. He's demonstrating with every utterance the disrespect he has for the tradition that is the United States government. And all you have to do is fucking listen to him, right? And so these mental gymnastics that people will go through to say, like, what didn't happen before, therefore it won't happen this time. Well, in some sense, it already did happen before. So unclear what you're talking about. But yeah, insofar as he's not dictator of the universe now, just look at the kind of stuff he says. And if this doesn't strike you as a flagrant disregard for democracy and its institutions, then I don't know. I don't know what to tell you. So that's a terrible talking point. And, I think Mark and Ben were just focused on policies, right? So their podcast is an hour and a half of them going through various policies. So they know Trump and his family, and they had dinner with him last week or something, which, I'm sure they weren't having dinner with Biden. So I'll just let that point stand. Take it as you will. Yeah. And so they're just working through a litany of policies and saying Trump is better on A, B, and C. I didn't know enough to be able to say, yes, this is wrong. But what was striking is even taking that what they were saying was correct at face value. And they had a little bit of hyperbole in there. If we don't enact this sort of policy, or if Biden gets his way, we're going to be at war with China and this sort of stuff. I take this all to just be hyperbole based on motivated reasoning, basically. Yeah. But insofar as the actual object level details about the policies they were discussing were correct, it just totally missed the point for me. It was that could all be true. And there's a broader issue at play. And so it was just really striking as an example of hey, means of error correction is not just this flighty phrase that is fun to say. It really fucking matters. And it really is what distinguishes some place like the United States of America from some place like Libya or something, right? Yeah. It's not a given that it stays that way. It's not a given that the United States is always this, shining beacon on a hill. And so, I've just been disappointed to see, and also disappointed to see people who call themselves Deutschians coming out also in favor of Trump and stuff. And I just feel like they're totally missing forest for the trees here, and they're letting their libertarians, I won't say who it is exactly. Do you think it's worth
saying?
Well, I'm not sure what some people's exact positions are, so I don't want to put words in their mouths, but just the general rhetoric of the Democrats caused these sorts of issues, and Trump won't be that bad, and our institutions are robust because January 6th was attempted and it didn't work out. I don't even.
I know that.
That's the most insane argument I've ever.
I don't know how to even react to that. I know.
So, but anyway, just this. I think people are just letting their libertarian side show. Not that Trump is even a libertarian candidate, so the whole thing doesn't make sense to me. But I think they're just clearly getting excited about libertarian-leaning policies and just forgetting. Yeah, I don't know. It's just hard to see, and people will just call me a partisan, I guess, but it's just hard to see people sort of forget this. I thought this meta level agreement we had about what makes places like Canada and the US so great.
And to say that January 6th wasn't a big deal because the 2,000 people stormed the Capitol building for only 3 hours and it was all turned out that was a goddamn insurrection. And I don't want to argue about the word insurrection, but it was a historic event, and it was and should be seen on the ladder of escalating violence. And the assassination attempt is another such rung of that ladder. It's now there's political violence in the United States of America, and that hasn't essentially been the case since JFK and Reagan and stuff. And that's really scary.
Yeah. And if you're not willing to admit that was a problem, now you're closing yourself off to anything that could perhaps be a warning of greater violence to come, right? So now you're saying that only an actual toppling of the democracy would constitute a worrying event. Yeah. And it's there's always buildups to worrying events, and this is one of them. And if you're just willing to say, democracy didn't fall, therefore that wasn't a worrying event, that's a totally fallacious argument that how you cannot see that.
This is democracy. This is democracy falling. It doesn't fall quickly. It falls slowly.
Yeah, exactly.
And this is what it would look like to have a democracy fall. Like back to Pinker and stuff, progress is non-linear, and we definitely have dips and troughs. And I don't think I'm going to go as far as saying the American empire is over. I know some people are saying that. I wouldn't feel comfortable saying that, but
that's not well on you.
Not while Ben Chug is on the case. But it's definitely the scariest thing I've seen since like 9/11, when I was too young to really appreciate what 9/11 was about.
Yeah.
It was so funny. I was thinking about the fact that you're in basically 2 book club podcasts. One where you guys read a book like every week, and the other one where you take 5 years to read a single book.
That's hilarious.
It's like the slowest possible book club and the fastest one. So with that let's start the next chapter of the book we've been reading for the last 4 or 5 years. Shall we? But yeah, welcome back to another episode of Increments. My name is Vaden Mazrani. I'm a senior research scientist in machine learning, and Mr. Benjamin Amsterdam Chug. I don't know. How's that? That was a bit weak of a middle name, but
it was appropriate. It was appropriate.
I was going to say Amsterdam Daniel, but I didn't know if the damn Daniel thing was going to land to any of our listeners. But yeah, I have my little blurb of like podcasty stuff to say. So let me just say it real quick. We are on Patreon and Twitter and YouTube and Discord, and obviously send us emails. Patreon, we've been doing some cool stuff there, right? Would you say?
Yeah. We've been much better about our Patreon episodes.
Yeah. So tell these ungrateful degenerates who aren't paying for the Patreon what they could be potentially listening to us talk about if they shell up a few shilling.
Yeah. So you could be listening to us talk recently it's been like every week we've been releasing a little Patreon only episode that's
we're the freaking best.
Yeah, we're on fire, man.
Yeah, we're so good.
I know. Sorry. There tend to be slightly shorter episodes, like 40 to 50 minutes, but we just talk about a variety of subjects, and often we disagree about stuff because there's slightly less, we prepare for them less, I would say, than the main episodes. So it's just sort of opinions off the cuff, and we get into some fun territory there. Mm-hmm. So yeah, recently we talked about addiction and preference falsification and revealed preferences, and whether intellectuals are just out to lunch on every possible real world topic.
The libertarian solution to the opioid epidemic, which is just give them all fentanyl, baby. There's more fentanyl for everyone. Yeah. At Death and Meaning, we talked about the passing of your uncle and what death and meaning, what death has to say about meaning if meaning requires death. And
Vaden is pro-death.
Oh, dude, I love it. Yeah.
That's the TLDR.
Yeah, just bring it on, baby. And then early access to episodes and all that good stuff. Ooh, and write us reviews. We just recently got a new podcast like metric tracker, and now I can see if people write us reviews. And so please, people, write us reviews. We need it. And with that, let's get into the main episode. So we are back finally doing Conjectures and Refutations series. It's been a while. Feel like I'm shaking off the cobwebs a little bit.
Almost forgot who Popper was.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. But I'm stoked. So we are doing chapter 19, The History of Our Time, an Optimist's View. And I had this really nice experience in this chapter of like getting some brand new insights that I'm excited to talk about it. Like the last chapter, I feel like I talked about it so much just throughout all of our other episodes that it was kind of like nothing new. But when I read this one, the first and second time, it just, some parts passed by me, but this time it landed, so I'm super stoked. I don't know. Do you want to set it? Oop.
Yeah, sure. I can set it up. So this was a lecture delivered by Popper, I believe by invitation, at the University of Bristol in 1956. Mm-hmm. So over 50 years ago now, and you would think a lecture delivered on the history of our time more than 50 years ago would cease to be relevant in any regard whatsoever. But you would be mistaken.
You'd be an idiot if you thought that.
Honestly, reading it felt like it could have been written yesterday.
Absolutely.
And a couple of the examples maybe would need to be swapped out. A couple of the words changed here and there. But in terms of just the general tenor of it, and the points he's trying to get across and attacking certain pessimistic visions of society and stuff, all of this stuff is still at play, which itself is perhaps a slightly pessimistic fact, perhaps. But in terms of, the general shape and flavor of the essay, it could have fit right neatly into the culture wars as they exist today. And so it's pretty exciting to read because it has relevance for all the issues we're dealing with as a society right now. Mm-hmm. So the lecture itself, I think he opens it by dedicating it to Eleanor Rathbone, who was a social reformer I hadn't heard of before, who was a UK member of parliament and advocate of women's rights. And Popper's aim is to just, quote, devote a lecture to a general, though tentative assessment of the problem of social reform in our time. What have we achieved, if anything? How does our Western society compare with others? These are the questions which I propose to discuss. So obviously very broad in scope, and he's just wondering, what are we doing here? Has anything worked? Are we going in the right direction? Are we going in the wrong direction? Do we have reasons to be optimistic or pessimistic or both? Then he breaks down his title a little bit. So the actual title of the chapter, which I forgot if you said, but let me just restate it. So it's The History of Our Time, an Optimist's View. And so by history, he means sort of political and social history of what he calls the Atlantic community, which I think can basically be viewed as sort of the Western world, the Commonwealth in Europe and America, etc. By time, he means a lot of different things. He means broadly maybe the time since like the Renaissance and stuff, but he also means more recent time for the last 40 and 50 years and sort of everything in between. So it's a full examination of exactly where the hell we're going and if we're doing anything right and what, if anything, we're doing wrong.
So a lot of the thesis of this chapter, I'd say, would be familiar to anyone who is acquainted with like the new optimists. Let's not say the new atheists, but the new optimists, such as Steven Pinker, Matt Ridley, Hans Rosling, etc. is just talking about how things have actually gotten pretty great over the last 200-300 years, and pushing back against this like cultural pessimism. But notably, he's writing this 11 years after World War II. So it's a pretty tough thesis to make after the Holocaust, and the memories of World War I were still fresh in people's minds. And so going to the chapter, think of it kind of as like a Pinker style thing, except obviously it was well before Pinker. Yeah. So I'm going to claim, and actually I'd just be curious your thoughts here. I'm going to claim that he strategically broaches a certain subject without bringing up the phrase Israel-Palestine, but is very much thinking about Israel-Palestine. And what I want to talk about as we go is how what he says here has so much to bear on the current political conflict, but because he's strategically not going to open with that and he's going to kind of sneak up on it, I think we should kind of do the same. And although his comments there are one of many points he's trying to make in this chapter, when you started by talking about its current relevance, that's the part that stuck out to me most of all, that went totally past me when I first read it. But let's get there in due course, and maybe with that as a bit of a tease for why I think that this is incredibly relevant to our listeners. Let's maybe go in roughly the order in which he covers the material. And so there's a lot of great quotable chunks in this chapter, and so I'm going to be quoting a bunch. But one of the things he wants to wrestle with at the very beginning is what he means by optimism. And he says the following. So, now I come to the word optimist. First, let me make it quite clear that if I call myself an optimist, I do not wish to suggest I know anything about the future. I do not wish to pose as a prophet, least of all a historical prophet. And on the contrary, I have for many years tried to defend the view that historical prophecy is a kind of quackery. I do not believe in historical laws, and in particular, I disbelieve especially in anything like a law of progress. And in fact, I believe that it is much easier for us to regress than to progress. And so before we get to his second paragraph, I just love that as a way to kind of set up immediately an apparent contradiction between his previous writing about how he cannot prognosticate about the future, especially the future of history. But yet, how can he, while recognizing that fact, also consider himself an optimist? And so I can read the second paragraph where he kind of resolves this tension, but maybe I'll just pass it over to you to get your reflections on that and see if you found that part as interesting and as nice as I found it.
Yeah, no, I thought it was great. I think it's an interesting foreshadowing of someone like Pinker, who basically takes exactly the same line. So the line, in fact, I believe that it is much easier for us to regress than to progress. Pinker seems to have the same thought in his head when he starts talking about the second law of thermodynamics, and he starts talking about entropy and how sort of it's the natural way of the universe to decay. I actually don't love Pinker bringing to bear thermodynamics into his discussion on progress. It strikes me as a little bit off topic, like he's talking at the wrong level there. But I think he's trying to get at the same thing, which is that there's nothing inherently easy, or if we just let things be, there's no reason to think that things will get better. And so it's all by means of our own attempts to better the world that the world will actually be better. And so, being super familiar with Pinker's thesis, it was interesting to read Popper and realize that, of course, on many of these subjects, Popper got there first. Yeah. And so that's really what that quote reminded me of. I also just love the word quackery. Yeah. I'm going to start using that all the time. Historical prophecy is a kind of quackery. Awesome.
So let me just read the paragraph that follows that. So, how can he call himself an optimist? His response is, though I believe all this, I think I may fairly describe myself as an optimist. For my optimism lies entirely in my interpretation of the present and the immediate past. It lies in my strongly appreciative view of our own time. And whatever you may think about this optimism, you'll have to admit that it has a scarcity value. And this part I absolutely love.
Yeah, this is awesome. It's hilarious. We have the exact same quotes like in our notes. Oh my God. Hysterical. Anyway, yeah.
In fact, the wailings of the pessimists have become somewhat monotonous. No doubt there is much in our world about which we can rightly complain if we only give our mind to it. And no doubt it is sometimes most important to find out what is wrong with us. But I think that the other side of the story might also get a hearing. So his resolution is simply an optimism based on the recognition that despite these forces working against us, we have made tremendous progress in the past, and progress into the future is, in fact, possible. It's very much reminiscent of Hans Rosling's brilliant line about how the world is bad, it's very bad, but it's better. And it's better, and it can potentially continue to get better. And that is such a necessary antidote to the wailings of the pessimists, quote unquote. And let's just make it modern for a second. All of the climate change doom and gloomers, all of the wokesters who are talking about how we haven't made an iota of progress since slavery had been abolished. All of the AGI gloomers who talk about how the world is good, fine, whatever, but it's soon to be over. The subject matter of pessimism tends to change from overpopulation to underpopulation, from global warming to climate change, from acid rain to, let's just forget we ever even talked about acid rain, for example. But yet the constant is that there is a drumbeat of pessimism, and it's the pessimists who get all the attention. And so with that description of what his optimism, the flavor, the tenor of his optimism, he's going to next move into a discussion of the two great reasons to be pessimistic, which will be communism and nationalism.
Yeah, on pessimism for a second, putting Popper aside, I've always been a little torn about how to think about this. So on the one hand, there is this brand of pessimism which says there will always be so many problems, and we're never going to be able to solve them, and in one way or the other the world is going to come to an end. And this is very common, and in fact I can remember myself thinking along these lines early on, like junior high school maybe, because you are just inundated with problem after problem all the time, and it's your teachers are telling you X, Y, and Z is wrong with the world, and these problems are so hard, we're never going to solve them. So there's this sort of brand of pessimism that says we cannot possibly make enough progress to thwart some inevitable demise. But on the other hand, you also need pessimists to point out the problems in the first place. So in principle, it is possible to take sort of the Popperian and Pinker style attitude and say, yes, there exist problems, but it's possible to solve these problems. And we can do that. But I often find just like psychologically, perhaps optimists are too optimistic in the sense that they are liable to deny certain problems that are indeed problems. And so let's take climate change as like as an example. So there's one camp that says climate change is so bad we're fucked, right? And we're never going to be able to do anything to stop it. And then, like, I think there's this view where it's like, this isn't a problem because we've solved so many problems in the past and we'll be fine. And so they're not even interested in hearing about any potential solutions to various problems surrounding climate change. And then there's sort of this third way, which says it is a problem, but it's a solvable problem. It's soluble in the sense that we can make progress on it, and the world won't necessarily end if we act correctly. And so I guess what I'm arguing in some sense is perhaps pessimism has its place. So there's a difference between pessimism and nihilism, I guess. But I guess just in public conversation at large, there is often this role for pessimists because they're the ones to often first notice the problems that we will have to deal with, right? And then it's the optimist role to say, okay, let's come up with some sort of solution to these challenges and believe that we can come up with solutions to these challenges. But yeah, I'm just wondering what you think of like the necessity of some form of pessimism as just the people who tend to actually recognize the problems as they arise. And yes, they often overblow it. And yes, they're often too pessimistic about our ability to solve them. But, we have to recognize problems at some point. And like, it's often the pessimists who do that. Yeah,
I think Coleman Hughes coined a great phrase for what you're describing, which I absolutely love. And he describes it as the paradox of the worrywart. I don't know if you've heard this one. Something like if you are on the Titanic and you're absolutely freaking out about the fact that you think that it's going to hit an iceberg and you successfully divert the Titanic from hitting the iceberg and nothing happens, then you're going to seem crazy. That's the paradox of the worrywart. The very fact of worrying so much about something can be the reason why we actually do something about said thing. And thus the thing doesn't come about. And those who are worrying about it are seen as nuts. And so we should keep that in mind, that successfully worrying about a large problem and thus preventing the problem from occurring doesn't mean we just need to forever dismiss everyone who worries about future problems in the future. So that's a good point. I know that Pinker talks about the role of activists. What I would say there is, though, I think that you can draw attention to stuff without falling into insane levels of hyperbole and fear-mongering. So I think that like EA drawing attention to poverty in Africa is maybe a great example of that, where it is a real problem. And if no one does anything about it, then it's absolutely going to get worse and we need to address it. But they don't talk about the problem of poverty alleviation in existential hyperbolic terms. They draw attention to it and then calmly and rationally work on it. And I think that that's the sweet spot that one wants to encounter, or one wants to try to strive for, because if you magnify a problem into something apocalyptic, then often the very terror can paralyze people from doing anything about it. Or in their terror, they reach for radical and counterproductive solutions.
Like they destroy Stonehenge.
Yeah, exactly. They throwing soup Christ, on, throwing what is it? Was it spray painting Stonehenge spray or throwing soup on famous paintings and stuff? Like, this is not accomplishing the goals here, people. And so I just think that we can hold Deutsch's maxim in our mind, which is that problems are inevitable, but they are soluble. And maybe I'll just add a coda to that. And we don't need to raise all problems to the level of apocalypse. I think that that's more often than not counterproductive. And it's not a resolution to the paradox, but it is, I think, a more moderate take. And so one can be maybe a rational pessimist in that sense. Although pessimism does have a way of exaggerating itself, I guess. I don't often see optimists get super duper enthusiastic about their optimism in such a way that they stop working on problems because they think they're going to solve themselves. But I do see pessimists get super animated about their pessimism to the point of paralysis or advocating for strikes on GPU centers, for example. And so there is maybe that interesting asymmetry about pessimism and optimism, and that pessimism can spiral out of control quite quickly. I think it takes constant effort to maintain one's optimism in the face of 24-hour apocalyptic news cycles. And so there is that countervailing force that will accelerate pessimism and dampen down optimism. And it takes work to be an optimist, but it doesn't take much work to be a pessimist. And that's an interesting asymmetry, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, probably not worth dwelling too much on this. I mean, my original point was more of a psychological one. So I agree in principle, it's best to take this third way. And that's ideally how you'd want civilization to function, right? Is people recognize that, yeah, of course there are problems. We spot these problems, then we work optimistically to be able to solve them, right? And so that's sort of what you're pointing at, the Deutschian, Pinkerian, Riddlerian attitude here. And so I agree that's sort of, that's the best perspective to perhaps have on the situation. But I was more just pointing to it does seem to be in actual fact, pessimists are the first ones to spot problems because they're on the lookout for them, right? They're the people at the front of the Titanic freaking out about icebergs. And so they're up there trying to push DiCaprio aside to look for icebergs. And so you naturally have the kinds of people who tend to be worriers about things spotting those problems first. And so it's just this interesting phenomenon where, like, yes, the people who first spot problems probably will blow them out of the water, but they're also playing their role in that they're finding those problems to begin with. And the rest of us who are happy-go-luckily going along with our day just might have been too hesitant to call out a problem or to think it deserves more attention or something. And so anyway, it's less about the optimal attitude and more about the psychology.
I think that's true when we talk about like large human scale problems, like the ones we've talked about so far, climate change, etc. But if I think about, say, entrepreneurship, I would say that Jeff Bezos would be an example of, or Elon Musk. They are definitely optimists, but they wouldn't have been nearly as successful if they weren't constantly on the lookout for business failings and potential areas where their business could collapse. And so I think optimism and pessimism manifests itself in many more domains than simply prognosticating about the future of civilization, for example.
Sure, yeah. I meant in the same way I meant with the subject material Popper's dealing with here. Yeah.
So anyway, so he's just established what he means by optimist. He's established that he's pushing back against a cultural milieu of pessimism. And then he pivots and says, so let's begin this essay with a challenge. And in particular, I want to challenge a certain belief, which seems to be widely held and held in widely different quarters, not only by many churchmen whose sincerity is beyond doubt, but also by some rationalists such as Bertrand Russell, whom I admire greatly as a man and as a philosopher. And so the belief that Russell expresses that Popper wants to push back against is the following. Russell says, "We have become very clever, according to Russell, indeed too clever. We can make lots of wonderful gadgets, including television, high-speed rockets, and atomic bombs, or thermonuclear bombs if you prefer. But we have not been able to achieve that moral and political growth and maturity, which alone could safely direct and control the uses to which we put our tremendous intellectual powers. This is why we now find ourselves in mortal danger. Our evil national pride has prevented us from achieving the world state in time." So to put this view in a nutshell, and again, this is what Popper's pushing back against, and this is maybe, just to step out for a second, this is how men as brilliant as Russell diagnose the problems of our time. This is what Russell thinks is the cause of our difficulties. He says, "We are clever, and perhaps too clever, but we're also wicked. And this mixture of cleverness and wickedness lies at the root of our troubles."
So I think probably a lot of listeners won't be that familiar with Russell, but they might be more familiar with E.O. Wilson or with Nick Bostrom. And so both of them have also expressed something akin to Russell's view here. So quoting E.O. Wilson, he said, "The real problem of humanity is the following. We have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. And it is terrifically dangerous. And now it is approaching a point of crisis overall." So the Paleolithic emotions and godlike technology is getting to this dichotomy that Popper's trying to point out, right? Where he said the godlike technology is our intellectual development and our Paleolithic emotions are our moral development. So yeah, E.O. Wilson is also expressing this view. Also, if you're a frequenter of online effective altruism circles, you might have heard the term orthogonality thesis. And this is one of the key perspectives that underlines AI doom and gloom. And it's the view that we can become smarter and smarter without our morals getting any better, right? So one can have a super intelligence that has the morality of
paperclip optimizer.
Yeah, exactly. Old school sort of tribalism, right? Where you just care about one thing and one thing only and don't care about your fellow man, etc. But can be as smart as you would like. It's to say that our intellectual development is completely orthogonal. It has nothing to do with, it's completely independent of our moral development. And so I think that thesis is getting at the same thing, basically, that Bertrand Russell says. This view, I guess I just wanted to highlight that this is not a view that's that unique. And I think Russell perhaps put it into words first, but it's still very much with us in the kind of movements we see today. And then, so Popper just attacks this head on and basically inverts this thesis. And this will be his first thesis. He phrases it as follows. He says, "My first thesis is this. We are good, perhaps a little too good, but we're also a little stupid." It's like such a cute little line. And he says, "It is this mixture of goodness and stupidity which lies at the root of our troubles. So instead of being clever and wicked, which is the Russell view, we are good but stupid." I think by stupid, he really means just sort of ignorant here, like unable to do everything.
And easily manipulated, because that's what's going to get to the Hitler stuff in a sec. But
yeah, exactly. So we are led by the nose, as he's gonna want to say. So maybe instead of me trying to explicate his view, I'll just quote him at length here. So he says, quote, "The main troubles of our time, and I do not deny that we live in troubled times, are not due to our moral wickedness, but, on the contrary, to our often misguided moral enthusiasm, to our anxiety to better the world we live in. Our wars are fundamentally religious wars. They are wars between competing theories of how to establish a better world, and our moral enthusiasm is often misguided because we fail to realize that our moral principles, which are sure to be oversimple, are often difficult to apply to the complex human and political situations to which we feel bound to apply them. So instead of being clever and wicked, we are too good, too moral, and our conflicts arise because of this conflict between various groups of people who want to better the world in such extreme ways and get overly excited by their own ideas, right, about how to live in paradise, about how to better our situation, that these become that there are tensions between these different groups, and conflicts arise out of these sorts of tensions. So it's a refreshingly optimistic take on why conflicts are arising.
So there's one, or listeners could think, as I thought, well, how is this optimistic? You're saying we're good and stupid. How is that any more optimistic than Russell's thesis, which says we're smart but evil, smart but wicked? And he just has like a quick little throwaway thing, which I just think is perfect Popper. So he says, "You may perhaps ask me why my first thesis should be a part of an optimist's view. And there are various reasons. One is that wickedness is even more difficult to combat than a limited measure of stupidity, because good men who are not very clever are usually very anxious to learn." And I love that. Stupidity and ignorance that we all have can be addressed and can be improved upon with much greater ease than wickedness. And so why this is optimistic is that we can make progress, and indeed we have made progress, on removing ignorance and becoming a little bit less wrong. But pure wickedness is not something one can negotiate with or make progress with. And this leads to the discussion of Hitler and Stalin. Because the first thing that people might suspect or might think is like, how can you possibly say, Mr. Popper, that we're good, perhaps too good, when we've just come out of the concentration camps of the Holocaust? And as the essay was being delivered, it was well known that there were Stalin's gulags and Lenin's gulags spread throughout the archipelago, which made up the Soviet Union in Russia. I'm completely convinced by Popper's thesis here, which is that these atrocities are exactly due to our misplaced moral enthusiasm. And that's what has allowed Hitler and Stalin to capitalize on this. The fascists and the communists genuinely believed they were making a better world. And that's what allowed them to tolerate the atrocities that they were committing because they thought it was in service of a greater good. And one of the best episodes of Radiolab, you remember Radiolab?
Yeah.
Did you ever listen to like the bad show episode of Radiolab? That was one of their vintage ones.
I don't think so.
Yeah, well, so they talk about, and I think this still holds up. So I know that Stanford Prison Experiment is completely bunk, but the Milgram experiments, I don't think are bunk. So just for the listeners, so the Milgram experiments are, the way it's typically told is you put a person into a room and they're the subject of the experiment, but they think that the subject is the person on the other side of the glass who is being taught a lesson. And the subject is being asked to deliver electric shocks. And the Milgram experiments are trying to figure out, just under orders, if I tell you, Ben, to shock this person, will you do it? Will you commit crime and will you cause suffering to other people just because you're following orders? And what Milgram found was that indeed, yes, people will do that. And that is seen as a great source of pessimism because under the right circumstances, you can get people to do very horrible things. But the point of the Radiolab episode is that is actually a complete misunderstanding of Milgram's experiments. And what Milgram did was he did that experiment in a myriad of different ways. So sometimes he would have two, quote, scientists who were talking to the subject and they would be arguing with each other and the obedience rates would decline. Or the scientist would wear like a lab coat compared to street clothing and it would change again. But the one constant, so when he interviewed after the fact, those who did go to 11 or go to 10 to do the shocks, they all said that they thought they were doing something for the greater good. They thought that the difficulties that they were undergoing, the guilt that they felt was worth it because they were participating in the project of science and they were doing something good despite the pain that it caused them, causing other people pain. And to me, that just provides so much insight into the mindsets of the vast majority of people who participated in these atrocities. I don't think it's the case that there was just some poison in the water in Germany in, say, 1935 that created a whole generation of psychopaths. I think it's much more likely that these people, like us, were just led by the nose, thinking that they were doing the right thing, following that moral goodness of theirs into the wrong places. And so when I was reading this chapter, I was just reminded of this old episode of Radiolab, which for the listeners is called The Bad Show, if you want to go through the archives. And it's just absolutely congruent with Popper's thesis here, that we have too much enthusiasm, our desire to do good is too refined, and that's what can lead us astray so often. And Hitler and Stalin are exact examples of this phenomenon.
So, okay, let's, do Popper the respect of trying to push back on this thesis a little bit. Let's not just be led by the nose by Popper. Nice. That would be quite ironic. So clearly he has a point here. Everyone, or at least nearly everyone that is psychologically normal, quote unquote, is pretty convinced of the goodness of their actions, at least convinced enough that they can sleep at night, right? So people want to do the right thing, and they very rarely if you ask someone to tell their life story, they are rarely going to come out looking like the villain, because people want to be good and they're not going to be able to live with themselves if they're not convinced, or if they're convinced they've done something seriously wrong. So, people want to view themselves as the good guy, and this will often align with them doing things that they think is for the good. But I don't fully buy Popper's thesis in that he pictures people as pretty naive. And so this cuts against someone like Hugo Mercier's thesis, right? That people are less naive than we think, and they often kind of know what's been going on. But Popper wants to say, people are following Hitler and Stalin because they've been sold this vision of how to make the world better. And this is basically saying they can be sold lies at an extravagant level, and they will buy into it because they think they're making the world a better place. This is somewhat true, but I also think it's not always true. And I think it's not always true because belief can be weaponized as a tool for self-promotion within a group, right? As a way to like show your loyalty to the group. And so it has this function to bind yourself with a group. And so this means that people can go along with certain social trends, not because they think those trends are morally correct, but because it makes their own life easier. So here's an example. So have you ever read the book Eichmann in Jerusalem by Hannah Arendt?
No, I've been meaning to. Yeah, I want to. It's on my list, but I haven't. No.
Yeah. So I think at the end of the book, she has this famous phrase where she says, Eichmann exemplified the banality of evil. Mm-hmm. And what this phrase means is that Eichmann didn't seem very ideologically motivated, right? He was sort of this normal person who fell into doing what he was doing because it was his job, because it helped him move up the ranks of this administration. It was part of his social station. And so in that sense, it was banal in the sense that he wasn't this frothing Nazi going to bed every night. It was just part of his life to do this thing. And so, sorry, I should step back and say Eichmann, I believe his first name was Adolf, actually. Adolf Eichmann. All right.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Anyway, sorry, yeah. But Eichmann, he was in charge of the transportation networks in Nazi Germany. So he was the one making sure all the trains could basically carry Jews from cities to these concentration camps, and was sort of thereby responsible for like sending millions of Jews to their deaths. Mm-hmm. And so it was this person, and he was put on trial after the war. I think he was found hiding out in South America or something. But he was this person who was undoubtedly responsible for tremendous suffering. And Hannah Arendt went to his trial to report on it and was struck by this banality, right? The fact that he didn't seem very ideologically motivated. And so what was going on there? There's no doubt Eichmann knew he was responsible for killing so many people, but he did it because it allowed him to sort of climb the social ladder around him.
And he didn't think he was doing good. Like, I would just want to, I haven't read the book, so I can't comment, but I thought that the part of it was that he thought that what he was doing was for the good of Greater Germany. And yeah, he's climbing the ranks, but what you've just described doesn't sound to me like he was wicked. It doesn't sound like he was overflowing with wickedness. It sounded like he was working for Amazon. Like he just the project of Amazon is a good thing. I'm just kind of banally working my way up the ranks and contributing to what I trust is a good project, which is the final solution, et cetera, et cetera. Like, did he think he was doing bad, or did he think he was doing good? And in that goodness, he was bored.
Well, okay. So from what I remember, like he does acknowledge, like, I kind of knew this was a bad thing, but I did it anyway. So I don't think to combat Popper's thesis here, you have to make the argument that like people are fundamentally wicked. You just have to say that they're led by the nose less easily than Popper wants to say, right? So Popper is he's inverting Russell's thesis in an extreme way. Mm-hmm. So for Popper to be wrong, you don't have to adopt Russell's thesis. You just have to say, actually, it's not always a desire to do good. It's sometimes people are doing bad because they can convince themselves this is, maybe sort of necessary and I'm going to get by. It's a very like social signaling type of thesis, right? Where we like convince ourselves that our actions are good because we want to fit in with a group. And because we're scared of the social repercussions of not fitting in with the group. And so you can sort of deceive yourself about your own actions in order to not to experience social isolation or something. I think Adam Smith was getting at a similar thing when he talked about the pinky thought experiment. Mm-hmm. Have you heard of this?
Yeah, but
where he says, you tell most people, if you tell most people tomorrow, like China's going to disappear off the map, then they'll be saddened for a moment and reflect on the ephemerality of life and then go on about their day, basically. But if you tell them they're going to lose a pinky, then they're going to stay up all night, worry about losing their pinky the next day. Yeah. So I guess my point is just that, like, I think if Popper were right, people would sort of be on the lookout more for reports that what they were doing was succeeded or failed. But I don't think this is the case, like wokeism, et cetera, all this stuff. I think people often take actions that are not necessarily because they think they're like the morally best thing to do. They take them slightly more selfishly because they don't want to be ostracized from their social group and whatnot. And I think people are a little less naive about the consequences of their actions than Popper wants to think, or that his thesis requires.
I'm not convinced. The signaling stuff I'm not super impressed with. I think it's trivially true in most cases, but like Hansen et al., I think just lean on that way too often to explain way too much. These things don't seem to me to be mutually exclusive. I think it's totally possible and in fact true that people who joined the SS both did it because they thought that they were contributing to a greater good, and also did it because all their friends were doing it too and wanted to get social rank.
You shouldn't look at people who joined the SS though, right? You're already selecting for people who are probably filled with moral gusto. What you should look at is like the millions of ordinary people who didn't join the SS but sort of kept their head down. Did they think it was always a good, that Nazi Germany was always doing a right thing? Some percentage of them, sure, but I'm not convinced it was everybody.
Certainly not. But if we're talking about the Hitler example as cutting against Popper's thesis, then we are selecting for those who joined those who didn't join the Nazis. We can assume that their sense of goodness was able to let them see through a lot of Nazi propaganda and bullshit and recognize that it's not right, or they just didn't prioritize that as highly as would be required to join the party. But the Hitler example is brought up precisely because it appears on the face that it's a bunch of evil people doing evil things. And so because we're talking about Hitler with regards to Popper's thesis, I think we do need to select for the people who've joined the party and are acting on it, right?
No, but his whole thing is that it's the average people. It's the rest of them. Like you have Hitler and Stalin, you have the thought leaders of these movements. Mm-hmm. And then it's the question of like, why did entire nations sort of like go along with them? And he says everyone was led by the nose. Mm-hmm. So they think Hitler and Stalin are doing all these good things.
Those who went along with them were led by the nose. Yeah.
Well, yeah, everyone who didn't do something, everyone who didn't speak out against it. Yeah. So everyone who didn't speak out against it was like convinced of the moral righteousness of these movements.
Okay. Well, maybe we're getting a bit too. No, we're not getting too into the weeds. Let's stay in these weeds. So we could maybe distinguish between those who joined the party, those who actively spoke out against it and fled, and then just the common Joe Schmo who kept their head down. Yeah. Is that what you're saying? And you're saying don't Vaden exclude the common Joe Schmo because they have to be included in this thesis as well?
Yeah. I mean, Popper's thesis is talking about these people. Why were they so effective? Why were Hitler and Stalin so effective? Because they appealed to the morality of their actions, right? They had to sell the moral righteousness of their visions to their people, right? And people went along with this precisely to the extent that they were convinced by this moral righteousness. And I'm saying, no, that's not the only thing going on here. Certainly some subset of people are convinced by the moral righteousness, but there's also a large contingent of people who are just like scared to speak out or adopt these kind of beliefs because they're socially beneficial.
But it's only the people who went along with it who are a challenge to Popper's thesis, right? The people who didn't go along with it aren't challenging his thesis that we're really good and really stupid, because those ones, they're the non-problematic ones. So they're the ones we don't need to explain, right? We only need to explain, for the purpose of Popper's thesis, those who did go along with it and their motivations for going along with it.
It depends what you mean by going along with it. So, okay, maybe let me use myself as an example here. Sure. Okay. So spring of 2020, George Floyd dies. I know, oh shit. Like I'm in the middle of the US, it's locked down. I'm like, this is going to be bad, right? And then protests start erupting and stuff. I had read enough stuff that was critical of BLM and some of their dishonest tactics, their dishonest statistics, that I was like doing pretty deep dives into like, what the fuck do we actually know about the statistics around black crime, around police brutality and stuff, and was, coming up with the sort of things that now we all talk about as sort of the consensus view. Like it was really unclear at that time that there were sort of all these systemic problems in police departments about disproportionate killings of black people, all this sort of stuff. And so I was like fundamentally skeptical of the thesis that basically all my friends around me were adopting hook, line, and sinker, right? I'm at Stanford. Stanford is very left-leaning, and everyone around me is like talking about going to these protests, all the problems with this stuff. And this was a very like discomforting time psychologically for me.
We recorded a podcast at the time, didn't we? Like we recorded a podcast like a week or two after it happened, right?
Yeah, so that was sort of like one side of what I thought about this stuff. And then the other side, I had all these social pressures because I was dating a girl at the time who was like definitely more left-leaning than I was. And, you know, she was very smart. She knew her shit. And we would talk about this stuff. But I was still, I think, scared to express my full opinion in that social milieu. And this ended up with me, like, I went to some of these protests. Now, I wasn't some of the people at the front yelling about how we should burn all the cops alive or whatever happened, right? But I was there, right? And I was like going along. For all intents and purposes, I was a member of this movement, right? Like, the people out marching in the street are, I think, fair to be called members of this movement. Did I believe? I knew at that point. So, okay, I was able to justify being there by like, okay, I do think there is a problem with police brutality. I don't necessarily think it's as disproportionate against blacks as many people are making it out. But I was able to convince myself, like, you know, there's enough of a problem here that's why I'm out here marching. But that was just sort of a justification because I knew what those marches were getting at, right? And they were trying to target a very precise set of issues, and their leaders were making a very precise set of claims that I knew, if I was being honest with myself, I disagreed with. But I was there anyway. So in some sense, I knew I was doing the wrong thing.
Oh, no, I don't. Clearly you weren't there because of internal wickedness. You were there because you're conflicted about what the goodness is.
No. But again,
like it was your drive to do good and being confused about what good looked like in that circumstance, which put you out in the street, right? It's goodness and stupidity, which is exactly Popper's thesis. It's goodness to go do something. And I don't want to say, obviously, not stupidity as an accusation, but
it was pretty apt.
It was confusion.
Yes.
It was confusion, right? So it was unclear what the right thing to do was.
I think that's putting too nice a gloss on it. Like, I think at that point, if you had really sat me down and been like, what are your actual honest opinions about this? I think I would have said something like, honestly, I think this is probably going to be harmful. Because remember, at this point, it was a huge push to literally abolish police departments. And it happened for a little bit in Minneapolis, I think, right? And I remember, I think I went to 2 of these protests. During the second one, that's when the Minneapolis Police Department got disbanded remember those few weeks there when they said they were going to disband? I don't think it eventually ended up happening. But I remember someone getting on a microphone at the head of one of these marches and being like, oh, we did it. Like, you know, the Minneapolis Police Department, the police commissioner or whatever just said the police department was going to be disbanded. And I remember in my head being like, oh, fuck, this is a really bad thing. But I was there anyway. Like, I know what you mean about, maybe the nicest gloss you could put on it is, I was morally confused about what the right thing to do was.
But you wanted to do the right thing.
Yeah, but I opened up my critique of Popper by saying, yes, most people think they're doing the right thing most of the time, but your beliefs can be leveraged in such a way to have you doing the wrong thing regardless of what you think about it. I knew I was doing the wrong thing. Like, I was participating in something that was probably going to hurt people had that movement gotten their way. Right. I don't think Popper's thesis can explain that.
I think it absolutely can. What are you talking? Like, so
I was participating in a movement that I knew at that time was actually going to cause more harm.
You did not know at that time. You were conflicted about it. Like, part of you thought.
I suspected at that time. Like, I was like,
sure.
I remember thinking like, oh, this is bad. Like, I would rather not be here. And yet I was there.
No, to argue against Popper's thesis, you would have had to know that what you were doing was bad, and wanting to do it because it was bad and because it was going to hurt more people. That's wickedness. What you're describing is goodness mixed with confusion.
To argue against Popper's thesis, you don't have to adopt Russell's thesis, right? Having good intentions and having totally wicked intentions are at the opposite spectrums. I'm just arguing there's a place to sit where you're taking action because there's a self-serving element. And you can know it can be wrong overall, but you realize, like, because you're pursuing a social station like Eichmann, or you don't want to be disavowed by a friend group, you do that thing anyway. And that's how I view that part of my life.
I love that you're comparing yourself to Eichmann in this conversation. It's hilarious. Let's snippet that, puppy. But no, man, what you're describing is you did not know that being there would have absolutely contributed to making the world worse. Like you said, you were of 2 minds about it. You were confused because you were listening to McWhorter and Glenn, And you were also surrounded by a milieu of people who were saying the opposite view. And you were genuinely trying to figure out what you thought about the thing. Like anyone who listens to this podcast and knows your voice knows you don't have a wicked bone in your goddamn body. What you're saying is that people do things for reasons beyond goodness and being led for the nose. There's other motivations out there that make people do stuff, right? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I don't think people are as naive as Popper wants to make them out to be. And we're not all just like trying to find the leader that is promising us moral righteousness and following them around. Like often we do things that we're not convinced are actually for the good of the entire
You're confused
group.
about his thesis. His thesis is that we're good, perhaps a little too good, and we're also stupid. Then someone says, well, what about Hitler? To which he says, well, we are also sometimes led by the nose, and that explains the participation of entire cultures in doing stuff that objectively we now know is wrong. So the led by the nose thing, I think you're interpreting him as saying we are always inevitably led by the nose, which is not what he's saying. He's saying that part of our excess of moral righteousness sometimes leads us to do actively wicked things, and that's how we can explain the existence of Hitler, Stalin, and the Crusades by viewing it not as a surplus of wickedness, but as a surplus of goodness that has been misled. But he's not saying that our being led by the nose also explains why we go to protests that our girlfriend wants us to go to. He's not saying that being led by the nose.
No, I'm attacking the surplus of good, right? Like I'm attacking this notion that like what we do is always chasing the
You
good.
are a walking example of someone who is overflowing with good intentions. Like you're a vegetarian. You donate 10% of your income to charities. You exercise regularly, and you're nice as fuck. You are not a counterexample to Popper's thesis.
But that's exactly why this BLM stuff is a good counterexample, right?
You're conflicted. This is conflict. Like,
but I
BLM,
just told you at that point I wasn't that conflicted. Like I was pretty sure. I was like, I don't think this is good. Like I was like, I would rather not be here right now. This is not a great thing. But I felt like, you know, a lot of my social circle at that point.
Like right now, you would have acted differently than 4 years ago. Yeah. Like right now, and is that not just because you have more knowledge?
Well, I'd like to think I would, but I don't know, dude. Like it's hard when it's genuinely hard. We're not all as combative as you are, right? Like it's hard when all your friends are like convinced about something, and you're trying to ask yourself like, okay, what exactly is going on here? I'm pretty sure they're wrong. I'm pretty sure there's a lot of dishonest rhetoric floating around right now.
Of course.
And like, and I was pretty sure that what I was seeing was like I don't think the phrase had coined at that point yet, but it was like the classic example of luxury beliefs, right? I was like, I think we have all these well-off, highly educated Stanford students who are, you know, taking this position on inner city crime. They know the causes. They know all this stuff. I'm pretty sure getting police out of all these neighborhoods is actually going to cause more harm, more death in the long run. And here I am anyway, right? That was my state of mind. And I'm not sure what to call that beyond following incentives that keep me inside an in-group, right? Keep me on the inside of a group of friends that I didn't want to abandon because it's the middle of COVID. And so like that's my point, right? Is there's incentives.
It's called being led by the nose. Like
no, because I wasn't led by the moral righteousness. I don't know. We're going to have to let this. We're going to have to move on. I think we're going to have to move on.
Yeah, I can't get into your mind. And if you're telling me that you did it because you wanted to fit in and because of signaling purposes and because you like having luxury beliefs and all this stuff, then sure, that I can't dispute that. It just that does not square with my impression talking to you like a week afterwards, and just everything I know about you is externally that doesn't jive with how I think about you. And I think if we were to go back and listen to episode 3 or whatever right after the fact, I think it would indicate that both of us were genuinely like, again, yeah, fair enough. I am more argumentative, and I definitely had strong opinions going into that. But you just strike me in this particular circumstance as genuinely wanting to do the right thing, having incentives that maybe push you in different directions, and slowly over time figuring out concretely what you think about the situation. But at the time, that is goodness. That's being led by, let's say, incentives instead of the nose. That's being led by social milieu, but wickedness does not come into play for me. And to argue against Popper's thesis is to adopt Russell's thesis in this context, and it's to explicitly say that. Why?
You can just be somewhere in the middle and just argue that incentives and social standing play more of a role than just our desire to do good. To negate Popper's thesis, you don't have to adopt Russell's thesis, right? These are polar opposites of one another. That's what I was trying to say. So you just have to argue, no, it's not always that we're like a little too good. It can be that a little too often we're selfishly following social incentives.
Yeah, in some contexts, for sure. I don't think that goodness describes everything, but saying that we desire to do good most of the time and we're stupid most of the time isn't to also say that some of our actions can't be better explained by incentive structure or by social groups.
Yeah, that's all I'm trying to get at here. Yeah. Which Popper doesn't say.
Because that's not the point of this text. I'm sure he says it in other contexts that incentives matter, and I'm sure we could find quotes of that. And to argue for incentives, etc., is not to argue against Popper. It's just to say that what he's described is not fully accounting for everything. Of course not. But he's arguing against Russell. But so I do think that to argue against Popper in this context is to argue in favor of Russell, given the nature of the discussion so far.
Only if you think people. Okay, well, we'll just have to let the listeners decide here. But this is just assuming that people are only good or wicked, which is just a naive view of humans, right? So that's why I'm saying to argue against Popper is not necessarily to argue in favor of Russell. Like there can be other explanations for why we do things, not just that we are fundamentally essentially wicked or fundamentally essentially good. It's to argue that often we are just selfish and following incentives. And so that's my point. And I don't want to keep rehashing this because now we spent like an hour arguing about this.
I won't say anything, but I think differently. Okay. I think we actually should break here because
this is long already.
Yeah. Well, the discussion about national self-determination is, I think, one of the most interesting things from Popper I've read in a long time, and it totally went past me significantly.
Oh, wow. Okay.
The first few times. Yeah. And
hopefully you can convince me it's interesting because I think he just defines self-determination in a way that no one ever has and then argues it's a bad thing. And then I was totally unimpressed by his argument.
Okay. Well, we didn't talk about Israel-Palestine yet, but that's coming up, baby.
Wow, we really got bogged down there. Holy shit.
Yeah, I think we'll have to edit the hell out of this one. But yeah, okay, so the chapter is too long to go in a single setting, so we are going to break for now and resume next time.
Ironically, it's one of his shorter chapters, but it's going to end up being the death of this podcast.
We haven't had a good one-on-one, just needling each other a little bit.
Yeah, that was good.
Just getting under your skin, it's important. Okay, sweet. So, to be continued, and I'm stoked to pick up where we left off.